and we have 7 panelists, and so we have divided the webinar in more or less 3 different parts. The first part will be an introduction of the topic itself. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about, and then a discussion where we're going to have different experts, international and national experts, and also practitioners, so that you can understand how different parts of the world tackle the same problem. So you're going to have the opportunity to ask your questions by using the option questions and answers Q&A. And so you can send your questions to the participants, to the panelists. So all of this is going to be available in French, in English, in Spanish, and in Burmese. So we're going to have different speakers. Anyway, you can have access to these languages. If you have a technical issue, do not hesitate and use the questions and answers. And my colleague Marion is going to help you in solving your problem. So the last point before actually getting started with the first 2 speakers is it is to let you know that this session is being recorded in all the different languages, and you're going to be able to find it on the different platforms, ILO platforms. So you can have the Academy platform, you can have a Migrant Workers platform. So on all these different platforms, you're going to get the recording. And also it will be available on the Knowledge Hub on fair recruitment of the ILO. So if you can't stay for the 2 hours, you can catch up later on, because this webinar is recorded. So at this point, I will start by introducing our first 2 speakers. It's a huge pleasure for me to introduce Mrs. Michelle Layton.
And introduce our first global expert, to Miss Michelle Layton. She is the head of the labor migration program at the ILO, where she directs the office work on labor migration and mobility and support policies and programs related to migrants and refugees. She has expertise in the field of international law, labor migration, human rights, and economic development. Thank you very much, Michelle, to be with us today. And Michelle, you will intervene in English during this first part of the webinar. We have also the important pleasure to welcome for the first time in an activities organized by the ITC-ILO, Mr. Felipe González Morales, who has been appointed by the Human Rights Council in June 2017 as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. Mr. González, you are professor of international law at the Diego Portales University in Santiago, Chile, where you are also the director of the Master in International Human Rights Law. Before being the special rapporteurs, you were a commissioner and the rapporteurs on migrants between 2008 and 2015 at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and where you was also president between 2010 and 2011. Thank you very much, Mr. González, for your presence with us today. It's a pleasure to welcoming you for this webinar. So let me first, as I say, and Mr. Just for information as well, Mr. González will intervene in Spanish. Without further ado, I will, Michelle, give you the floor for officially starting the webinars on protecting the rights of migrant workers in an irregular situation. The floor is you, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Miriam, and so great to see everyone here. Welcome to all of you, and good afternoon, good morning to some of you, and thank you so much for joining this event. ILO is very happy to be convening this event on the topic of key concern to many governments and stakeholders, and certainly they will be meeting this week at the Global Forum on Migration and Development, where labor migration will be one of the roundtables and key thematic areas. ILO has released a global study on the protection of migrant workers in irregular situations that we hope will be useful to those discussions, but also to improving national policies. People have migrated for centuries for many reasons, but mostly to find work. And our estimates show there are now 169 million migrant workers today, nearly half are women, who represent about 70% of all working age migrants. And we know that migration can bring positive and empowering experiences to migrant workers and their families, and it can benefit communities in origin and destination when it's well managed and rights are protected. Migration, however, is subject to many restrictions and state sovereignty, and many people who seek to move do not have access to regular pathways. Now, there are no certain figures on how many people migrate through irregular channels, but some have estimated it could be as high as 50 million. Without decent work options at home, labor migration, we know, will continue to be a reality. And some will take dangerous journeys that result, sadly, in tragic deaths. Recent reports, for example, indicate that this year, over 130,000 people have already crossed the Mediterranean, and 40,000 have crossed the English Channel in small boats, and hundreds have died. There are many interlinked drivers for irregular labor migration, but they include the growing inequalities and financial crisis, political conflict, exploitive recruitment practices, climate change, and complex immigration rules, as well as the use of gender-based migration bans. The treatment of migrants in these situations is of great concern to the ILO. All migrant workers, regardless of status, have human rights, including labor rights, which should be respected. Yet we see that undocumented migrant workers are too often excluded from the labor market. They're forced into the informal economy, face detention, and the risk of deportation. And having an irregular status puts migrants at a higher risk of exploitation, as well as violence and harassment. They might be receiving poor wages, working conditions, and often lack social protection. This treatment may not only be inhumane, but it can undercut wages for national workers and generate negative public perceptions. And women migrants, are particularly vulnerable in the workplace, often finding themselves in informal, isolated types of employment, like domestic work, where they don't feel they're able to complain or to leave their employers. The IMRF this year, at its meeting in New York, did recognize the progress made by some states to reduce the situations of vulnerability faced by migrants in an irregular situation. For example, states relayed that they facilitated access to regular status and to the formal economy and to basic services. It's fair to recognize, though, that regular migration pathways still remain limited, especially for low-skilled workers. And it's a good step that governments made a number of commitments in the Progress Declaration at the IMRF. These include to enhance and diversify the availability of such pathways, including in response to labor market realities and to disasters and climate change. Commitments include establishing bilateral labor migration agreements to optimize education and skills and training and fair recruitment, to expand regularization and family reunification programs, among others, including providing better information to migrants about their rights and obligations. Certainly, we think building these commitments into national migration policies will be essential. But policies have to also be grounded on human and labor rights to be effective in addressing irregular labor migration. And the ILO study on this topic, the Compendium on Irregular Migration, hopefully you can see that we've released, also provides a comprehensive examination of what are the country practices around the world, and provides a roadmap for achieving better solutions. It includes significant guidance on international labor standards that apply, including on equal treatment, non-discrimination, social protection, and fair recruitment, and on the role, importantly, of workers and employers' business, among other actors, and also how they're responding. During the pandemic, some countries adopted a number of measures that are moving in the direction of regularization. For instance, regularizing undocumented workers through visa extensions, through amnesties, or removal of work or residence permits, or the renewal of work or residence permits. And they help migrant workers to access healthcare, essential services, and regular work. Other countries are adopting more permanent mechanisms that may grant regular status to migrant workers in vulnerable situations, but also to meet labor market needs. For example, some have identified they will be creating residence permits to regularize migrant workers in sectors where they know there are major labor shortages. The ILO report provides countries with recommendations to improve their labor migration schemes. At its heart, these include to bring more coherence between migration and employment policies based on fundamental rights. Migrant workers who lose their job should not automatically be deemed in irregular status, and they should have the flexibility to change employment. Assuring fundamental rights is key, and ILO is releasing another report, this on freedom of association and collective bargaining for migrant workers, including on the rights of undocumented migrants, that we think can also be useful in this regard. And we're expanding our support on the ground, building capacity of countries to adopt or revise their appropriate policies. We're working with business and trade unions to implement good practices in addressing irregular labor migration. And some of this is through support to migrant resource centers at the community level that can inform migrants of their rights and provide legal counseling. Let me conclude by saying that people migrating through irregular and dangerous pathways need our help, both in their home country and in the country in which they arrive. And taking a more humane approach will advance social justice and the rights of all workers, irrespective of their nationality or their status. We hope the discussions today will contribute to building a more inclusive and diverse society. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for your very clear and interesting introduction. What I get from your intervention, and I think you clearly highlighted, is all workers, regardless the status, have human rights, including labor rights, that should be respected. And it's very interesting also to see that through the ILO study on this topic, the compendium, you looked also at some of the practices that around the world. So I see that some of my colleagues put in the chat the link to this compendium that is now available in the 3 languages, French, English, and Spanish. So I hope that would be an interesting tool as well for all participant practitioners which are working on protecting the rights of migrant workers, including the rights of migrant workers in a regular situation. Thank you again very much, Michelle, and looking forward exchanging with you during the webinars with the other panelists and also with the participants. I will now give the floor to Mr. González Felipe, who will, looking at the rights of migrant workers in an irregular situation under the UN International Human Rights Instrument. Mr. Felipe González, me permito de preguntar las preguntas en español. Tengo 2 demandas para usted.
Mr. González, I have 2 questions for you. What are the rights? What are the rights of the undocumented migrant workers under international human rights law in your experience, and where do you see the main challenges? The second question would be, where do you see progress made for undocumented migrant workers to enjoy these rights in practice, and what would be some further recommended actions. Now, I give you the floor. Thank you very much for your kind invitation to participate in this webinar. Here, the sun is setting all the time, so I'm not sure how is the illumination all the time. I am so glad to be part of this webinar and to be able to have a dialogue on regards to migrant workers in irregular situations. This is a topic of great relevance for the rapporteur, and we see that in all the thematic reports and country reports that address the situation of those who are under irregular migration situation. And for instance, a report presented by the Council of Human Rights a few years ago, we were able to mention the topic of freedom of association of migrants that are under irregular conditions, and especially the freedom of association and right to organize on behalf of migrants in irregular situations. Each one of them, independently of their migration status, including those in a regular situation, they have the right of human rights access. It provides a great framework to guarantee the non-discrimination and protection of human rights of all human beings, including migrants, irregulars, and regular, and their rights at work. The more relevant rights are the right to live, to health, to a decent life, to work, to freedom of speech, freedom of association, of non-slavery or cruel or inhumane treatment, etc. The states, they have to respect, comply human rights of all migrants that are within their territory or control, including those who are in a regular migration situation. The states committed to defend the principles of human rights, and in this sense, they committed to guarantee the respect, the protection, and the compliance of human rights of all migrants independently of their migration status within the migration cycle. In the practice, there are challenges to respect the human rights of irregular migrants. Among them is to guarantee effectively the provision of services and migration law implementation to the access of basic services for migrants. How can we address these issues when irregular migrants, even though they contribute to local economy, they're excluded from the benefits, among others? It is important to mention that all human rights are interrelated. They have freedom of association, right to organize, to be part of a trade union. It's essential so they can express their needs, protect their economic interests, cultural and social, and to defend the rights, especially through the trade unions and migrant organizations. Irregular migrants, they need to execute their rights. As stated in the rapporteur report that I refer to, there are some promising practices. For instance, in the case of Spain, the law of acknowledgement of the freedom of association of migrants established that foreigners, they have the right to organize freely or to be part of a professional organization and the right to protest, same as national citizens. In Korea, they acknowledge a trade union of migrants in the country, and previously their register was declined because there were irregular migrants. In the context of labor migration, migrants in a regular situation, they are vulnerable of labor exploitation. Some other categories are more vulnerable as migrant, temporary migrant workers, domestic migrant workers, women, and children. About this, I would like to mention the following points. It's important to create a comprehensive migration labor policy, including those who are in regular situation. It is important to develop policies and adequate intervention taking into account gender to protect all migrants, including access to decent work and their livelihoods, to provide labor mobility and decent work, and to optimize the opportunities and guarantee the right to have a healthy life and their situation of those people who are under vulnerable conditions. It can reduce the dependency of migrants to irregular migration, including in the case of migrant workers, and also the states to plan the future in a more reliable manner to guarantee that all migrant workers are protected against discrimination and that they can enjoy equality with the national. It's an effect of regular migration. On regards to the trends, migrant workers in those irregular situations should not be treated as a threat. Penalization will promote those migrants in irregular situations are illegal due to their work position, avoiding discrimination and xenophobia. Those who are migrants in irregular situations, if they are not authorized, they can execute a remunerated activity in the country of destination. The term irregular is the adequate terminology to solve the situation. The use of an legal term to describe irregular migrants, it's inadequate and should be avoided because they tend to be affected. The state should define plans, programs to address these irregular policies in a comprehensive and holistic manner without criminalizing them, bearing into account the importance to create an orderly and regular initiative of elaboration of policies that are focused on people to incorporate and encourage different groups in society. Finally, I have decided to work on my following report in June 2023 to mention the importance of expanding and diversifying them on regards to human rights, reducing the vulnerability of migrants, responding to the realities and labor needs, and guaranteeing that migrants, including those that are in situation of vulnerability, can have access to efficient access and to bear in mind human rights for their consideration. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Gonzalez, for your kind intervention. It is very interesting also to see how is your approach into rights and all those rights, human rights, they relate to each other and that Also, you included that the freedom of association is essential so migrants can express their difficulties and those irregular migrants as well. Thank you very much for your kind intervention. We have a lot of questions on the chat for you and for Michelle, but right now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Jared.
Now to our next speaker. So we are in a way now moving a bit in, I would say, in the panel of discussion, having the chance to have with us different practitioners, global experts, national experts as well, joining us for this panel. The first panelist to whom I will give the floor is Mr. Jared Beckley. I hope you hear me well.
I do, yes, hello.
Hello, Mr. Jared Beckley. So I will introduce you very briefly. You are manager of claim investigation with the Employment Standards Branch for the provinces of Manitoba in Canada. You have been with the branch for the past 15 years, and you used to work as an officer investigating matters related to migrant workers. And for the past 5 years, you have been leading the team that oversees and enforces the Worker Recruitment and Protection Act. I will take advantage, if you don't mind, also to introduce all the panelists and then give you back the floor for some questions we prepare for you. So the second panelist for this second part, I would say, of the discussion is Mr. Maurizio Bove, who is the head of the Immigration Department of CIS Milano Metropolitan and president of ANOF Milano. You have been, Mr. Bove, dealing with policies for the integration of migrant workers and citizens for over 20 years. And since December 2021, you have been elected Secretary of FISACAS Milano Metropolitan, where you are actually dealing particularly with the sector of tourism, commerce, catering, business services, and domestic work, in which sector there are a lot of migrant workers that are actually working in Italy. So they also represent about 1/3 of your subscribers. And so it's a pleasure to have you with us today because I know that you have done quite very interesting things in Milan. So we will hear from your experience from as a trade unionist. Je vais passer en français maintenant. Nous aurons aussi le plaisir que nous avons un représentant des travailleurs, d'avoir également la
French. We also have a representative of employers, Alice Serrani, director of the Recruitment Association in Casablanca.
Y quiero poder también
So you are a
presentar a mi
member
compañero
within the social
de la
of the
Confederación
Employers
General
Organization. This the Confederation established in 27 to represent the private sector vis-à-vis the government. So among your tasks within this social committee, you are involved with issues linked to migration at international level. You are the focal point in Morocco at the International Organization of Employers concerning migration. It's your
Miss Niha Misra. Niha, you are the global lead for migration and human trafficking at the Solidarity Center, the largest US-based international workers' rights organization. Previously, you served as the Deputy Country Program Director in Indonesia, where you managed the Solidarity Center Counter Trafficking in Person, Labor Migration and Democracy programs. Prior to your current position, you supported Solidarity Center program throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. Before joining Solidarity Center, you worked in Bosnia and Herzegovina on post-war election and democracy, and in the US as a senior attorney with the US Department of Justice. And last but not least, we also have the pleasure to have with us today Ms. Michelle Levoix, Director of the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, PICUM. Michelle, you have led the organization for nearly 2 decades in advocating for undocumented migrants' human rights toward Europe and global institutions. You have played a key role as board member for several civil society organizations at the global and UN EU levels, and you hold a degree in French, Justice and Peace Studies, and a master in Applied Science, Housing and Development. Thank you to all the panelists for joining us today. I think it's quite a very interesting diversity. We have a very different profile, but also very different experience covering different parts of the world. So thank you all for joining us today. And let me maybe start with you, Jared, and 2 specific questions we have for you. So I will start with the first one and then give you the floor. And then, as I said, we have a second questions that I will ask you later on. So Jared, what are the features of the current regulatory and enforcement framework in Manitoba that, in your view, can be seen as effective to prevent and address abuses of migrants in an irregular situation? Can you also elaborate further on the requirement for employers to register and the upfront indication and targeted enforcement based on risk factors? These are quite something very specific in Manitoba that I know as well has been being very inspiring for other provinces in Canada. So without further ado, Jared, I give you the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, I think the second part of that question addresses some of the first part. I think I have about 5 minutes here and I can get through it. So basically in Manitoba, we start with a registry. So all employers who wish to use migrant workers must first register with us. And this serves a few purposes. Firstly, we now know where all migrant workers will be when we want to go do an inspection. Without that, we're operating a little blind because it's at the federal level really that employers are going to bring people through into Canada and then ultimately into the province of Manitoba. So that registry is key. It also gives us the opportunity up front to address any concerns that we have with an employer, give them education, give them information, and just see that everything is being done correctly before a worker is even brought on board. And because we are the labor inspectorate, we know about businesses that are potential bad actors. And so we can bar them from becoming registered before they ever have the opportunity to use a more vulnerable set of workers like migrant workers. So that registry is an upfront key to the legislation. And another is that all recruiters must be licensed. So only those people who already belong to specific regulatory bodies, either a law society, so a lawyer, or an immigration consultant who also have a regulatory body that govern their work, can be licensed in the first place. So you can't just get into the business of recruiting migrant workers unless you are already a professional in that capacity. And then you have to become licensed with us. And if you have any wrongdoing or issues that are found at any point, you'll lose that license and lose the ability to continue on with that work. So that's kind of the administrative front end of the legislation that sets us up for success before we even really get started. One of the key issues I think that a legislative framework has to have is to bring liability for wrongdoing into your jurisdiction as well. And so by getting registered with us as an employer or by getting licensed as a recruiter, what you were doing is you were taking on the responsibility to ensure that there is safe travel from a country of origin to Manitoba as a destination, meaning that if some unscrupulous actor in another market, another jurisdiction, another country is charging fees to a worker in order to facilitate getting them to Manitoba, an employer is liable for that. And so they have to ensure that no one has done that along the way to the migrant worker, or it will be their bill to pay, unless they use a licensed recruiter. And then it is the recruiter who's taking on that liability. And if you didn't do that, then one of the problems that occurs in migrant worker fee charging scenarios is that they often happen in another jurisdiction, either in the original jurisdiction or somewhere along the way for travel. And we don't have the ability to go after third parties in different countries. We have to bring that jurisdiction or home. And so that's what our legislation does. And then once we're set up for that, then we can conduct proactive investigations. So proactive investigations meaning we don't need complaints. We can do targeted investigations into high-risk areas, say like agriculture or live-in caregivers. We'll know in advance what type of work is being done and where because of the registry system. And then we can follow up without invitation as well. So we're allowed workplace anytime. We can also at any time, we can either take them out of their work environments to meet with them or meet them at a neutral site at a different time. Those are the things that the legislative framework sets us up to do, about which, I'm aware of some other legislative frameworks that don't have that capacity. You're very limited in what you can do if it relies solely on complaints coming forward, or if you are limited in the way that you can address workplaces or the time frame within which you can address workplaces. So you want a really broad scope to be able to act. We can also take complaints, of course, but the proactive investigations and targeted investigations are key. And then just beyond the legislative framework, to answer the question a little bit more broadly, you also need to have a framework for information sharing. So in Canada, we have 14 different jurisdictions. There's 10 provinces, there's 3 territories, and then there's the federal government as well. And you have a variety of agencies that get involved in migrant worker issues. So we sit on interjurisdictional working groups, mostly at a policy level, but there's operational people like myself who sit on those groups as well. We have an information sharing agreement with the federal government and the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. We have also established relationships with our counterparts, mostly employment standards agencies in other jurisdictions, so that we can have conversations, because a lot of migrant worker issues don't just happen in a singular area. And a lot of people who are operating in this realm don't operate in a single jurisdiction. Rather, they have a broader scope, and they'll go out to, say, neighboring jurisdictions or nationwide or potentially internationally. And so you really do need to facilitate those relationships in order to be able to enforce things back home. So I think that those are the advantages for the Manitoba legislative framework that will help address these issues. I can take any questions on that. I want to respect the time here, so.
Thank you very much, Jared. And please don't hesitate to use the chat box for asking your questions directly to Jared. So I think it's very interesting indeed to see how this registration system, is a way to enhance and having better fair recruitment process. And maybe, yes, indeed, I would be very interested maybe during the question and answer to know if you have seen also this system as a way also to better address the question with regard to regular labor migration, and if you have seen already some changes. I have a second question for you, because you rightly mentioned, you are doing labor inspection, and effective and adequate inspection are indispensable to ensuring migrant workers in irregular situation can exercise their rights, and also tackling unauthorized employment. But at the same time, very often we see that this objective can only be met if the workers covered are convinced that the primary task of the inspectorate is to enforce the legal provision related to condition of work and workers' protection. And sometimes workers in a vulnerable situation may not be necessarily willing to collaborate with labor inspection services. They might be they might be in fear of the negative consequences as a result of inspection activities, such as, for instance, the loss of job or the exclusion as well from the expulsion from the country. How do you address these challenges in practice while conducting labor inspection visits? I give you back the floor, Jared. I don't know if you hear me well.
Miriam, I hope you're hearing me. I have to apologize. My internet connection seems to be cutting in and out.
I do hear you well now. I don't know, Did you hear well my questions? Do I need to repeat it or is it fine?
Fortunately for me, you sent it to me beforehand to pull
so
back
you have it.
the veil for everybody here. I was aware of what the question is. So I didn't hear you ask it, but I did read it beforehand. So unless it's changed, I'm happy to answer.
No, it's the same. Please go ahead.
Well, and I mean, since there's a chat portion, I mean, I would love help with this question as I think cooperation with and participation from migrant workers is ultimately the key to being able to enforce any legislation of this sort. And it's a difficult task because of the nature of the situation that they find themselves in. So for us, a labor inspectorate is concerned with enforcing minimum standards in force or endanger the immigration status of a worker. So really a firewall of sorts has to exist between labor and immigration. However, even if you have been able to accomplish that, that doesn't mean that the worker who you're concerned with has that same understanding. And if they're worried about their status, then they're far less likely to come forward and participate, which is quite understandable. So we have ready access to professional interpreter services right on hand. Either we can bring individuals with us when we know what we're getting into beforehand. We have them available on the phone. And the purpose there is that we want to have good communication. Hopefully, what you have is you have a team of people who are adept at rapport building, at just communicating our intention and assuaging concerns, like getting rid of the concern of the worker that this is somehow going to affect their status. Not always an easy task. So we can also translate our information into a variety of languages in a written form as well. As I said in the previous question, we can meet workers in the workplace, but we can also meet them at neutral sites and arrange to do that where they're away from, say, the watchful eye of the very person that they're concerned with, their employer. It's an interesting balance to try and strike, because you do also need to have a connection with immigration. Because if someone is in a situation of abuse and we're there to protect their rights, we can protect their rights in terms of wage payments or having been forced to, say, pay illegal fees or any of the sorts of things we might want to discuss here. But we're not actually the agency that will help change their immigration status for the better. In Canada, there is an agency called Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, IRCC, and they've implemented a new program, I think as of 2018, to help change somebody's work permit status when they find themselves in situations of abuse, so that they can become more mobile and find new areas to find work and move away from that situation of abuse. And so we have encountered that. And now it is up to us to try and connect them to the proper resources. Because of those relationships that we've maintained with immigration, we can try and make those connections while still kind of having the delicate balance of relaying the message that we are not immigration. We're here to protect your rights as workers. And really, beyond having access to native language communication, written materials that they can get, and neutral meeting sites, it's really just good communication and rapport building. But like I said, for the chat portion and further discussion portion, I'm all for talking other strategies. It is a difficult one, and I think it's probably the biggest issue from a labor inspectorate's position in terms of successfully addressing worker concerns. If they're not willing to talk with you, you won't get very far.
Thank you very much, Jared, for your frank and clear intervention. I think it was very interesting, also to hear it from the perspective as well of a labor inspector. And I think the point you highlighted of also obviously the need of collaboration and cooperation is key. And I'm thinking, of course, I assume a lot of cooperation that also can be done with the help of the social partners, and particularly, for instance, the role that could be played by trade unions, also for facilitating as well the discussion dialogue with migrant workers. And that's lead me to the next speaker that will talk about the role that could be played by trade unions. And just for your information, Jared, if you might see, there are already some questions for you in the chat. I will also, in any case, raise them to you if you want later on, but just for you to know, there are already some questions for you in the chat. Let me now give the floor to our next speaker. So Maurizio Bove. Maurizio, you will, just for our participants, Maurizio will answer to my question in Italian, but obviously interpretation will be provided in English, Spanish, Burmese, and French as well. But just for your information, so Maurizio will speak in Italian. Grazie ancora Maurizio per essere con noi oggi.
So thank you very much, Maurizio, for being here today. So I have two questions for you. The first is extremely important. We talk about the role that the trade unions can actually play. And the gentleman who spoke before you actually mentioned this, the role of freedom for migrants to become members of a trade union, for example. According to you, with your experience, what can be the role, the fundamental role that trade unions can play when we talk about irregular migrant workers? I don't know if you can, by answering this question, if you can elaborate a bit on what happens to female workers, migrant workers in an irregular situation. So good morning to all of you, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having invited me to this extremely important webinar. Now, please allow me to just tell you a bit about irregular workers, male and female, in Italy. So very correctly, also words are extremely important. So one of the first things that the trade union can do, and do this every single day, is to give a correct information on the snapshot of the migration in our country, in other words, Italy, and also in the city of Milan. We often talk about irregular workers, and then we talk about illegal or clandestine. So why do we define them as such? In Italy, we have approximately 350,500 people who do not have a work permit. So we cannot be too precise, but more or less these are the figures. They are irregular for two basic reasons. The first is because they reach Italy with a visa for a tourist, so they are overstayers. So after having come to Italy as a tourist, they stay longer than 3 months because they find a job, and above all, they find sectors where there is a huge demand for labor, and these people take up these opportunities. The second reason for irregular migration is the irregularity of their possibility to return home, especially due to the crisis in this last period after the pandemic that has struck in Italy, especially in the city of Milan, certain sectors where these people used to find a job. So many people have lost their work permit, and so they are now in a situation of irregularity. So what can we do in order to help these workers who do not have a working permit? So we must work as a trade union, and we do it in order to ask a change of the law, the migration law. So we need this change. We need this amendment for the entry, because we have the legal channels and they are linked to the 4C decree. So it's a distance call that cannot match the demand and the offer. And also it is absolutely fundamental for these people who come to Italy with a tourist visa, so with a legal entry, it is necessary that when they find a job and they get a contract, they can change this tourist visa into a permit, into a working permit. So we get tens and tens of calls from employers who are asking how they can make these workers a regular employee, because they have experimented this problem. But we have to respond. We have to answer to it. It's not just families, it's also companies. They cannot do it. So they have to not hire these people because they cannot do it, and they cannot give a regular job to these people. So we need this amendment. We need this change. And in Italy, we have 9 different possibilities to modify the law. And during the last time, during the COVID pandemic, was that of extending the possibility of making these migrants regular migrants, not just for agriculture, for fishing, or for domestic workers, but we have also managed to add domestic workers, even though all the other sectors have been excluded. That in a city like Milan, you see people, foreign workers, for example, in restaurants, in tourism, hotels, hotelery. So all these workers have been excluded. And so at this point, all the employers have had to pretend that they were hired as domestic workers. And then when they finally get the permit to stay in Italy, they had to fire them as domestic workers and to hire them again as waiters, cleaning staff, etc. So once again, the law has to be changed. So we, the union, are trying to extend all of this so that people do not have to go back to their country when they finally get the permit to be hired, so we can become regular migrants here in Italy when there is an offer, a real offer. And to be more specific, in our territory, we want to carry out advocacy actions vis-a-vis the region of Lombardy, especially for sanitary assistance. In Italy, we have the possibility of offering this when it's an emergency, obviously, to anybody, either if they don't have a regular working permit. But we had to press the region, because apart from the emergency ward, and you also have to consider the children of these workers, of these irregular migrants. So once again, you need to have a doctor who has to be assigned in a specific manner for these people, for their children, for example, and not just in an emergency ward. once again, we already have open doors. There is no type of exclusion, whether they are irregular or whether they are men, women, and we welcome everybody, and we always give them information on the laws that allow them to make them become regular workers. So we're always very open, and we welcome them all. Thank you very much, Maurizio. It has been extremely interesting. We've seen how the role of the trade unions is extremely important, because of course you are pushing to have this amendment of the law, and also the social dialogue is extremely important. So very interesting to hear you talk, and of course we're going to talk with employers, and so once again they try to make these workers regular workers. And of course there is a lack of coherence between political action, the labor law, and the needs of the labor market. And also the last point you mentioned, which has been extremely important, and today we have seen it after the pandemic, the access to health for migrants, for their wives or husbands or children, and their families, in other words. So you are the director of Enough, and you carry out a huge work talking about access for migrants to all of their rights. So do you also help migrants in irregular situations? Well, thank you very much for the second question. And like I was saying, we are an open door, like a gateway for all of these workers and all the different citizens coming from other countries, for all the different services and different categories of the trade union have. There are no separations, no differences. They need to have a permit. Talking about their rights as a worker for a certain sector, for example, domestic workers, we have assistance for these people, and sometimes we have situations of exploitation. These people, we can somehow act vis-a-vis the employer. So we talk about the right salary that has to be paid, working hours, etc., and so forth, even though these people do not have a regular work permit. Furthermore, we try to work within the limits of the law to make sure that these people will get a regular permit for people who don't have it. We have done this with 2 different projects, and we have tried to include in the market the refugees who are asking for asylum. The people who are asking for asylum often are people who came irregularly, or sometimes they find themselves in a situation of irregularity, and they try to get a work permit by asking asylum, not because they want to somehow step over the law, but because they have the right to do it. So what have we done vis-a-vis these workers? We have included them in training programs. So training in Italian or with a specific profession, and also stages in different companies. Once again, I underline the importance of crossing the demand with the offer. In Italy, we have a huge need, especially in certain sector, for people. For example, restaurants, they are desperately asking for people and they can't find them. And on the other hand, we have people who are looking for a job. So we need to blend, we need to merge these and overcoming the short circuits of the law. And through these training courses, we have people who manage to find to get a contract through their permit. And when the Commission will not give them the asylum, so they are not recognized as needing or benefiting from this, since they have done the different courses, we can ask for a new possibility so that they can get another kind of permit for humanitarian reasons. We are trying to make people understand that the demand, the offer is extremely important. We must overcome a law that cannot understand reality vis-a-vis people who are looking for a job and who would want to come legally, and also the companies who desperately need staff. Thank you very much, Maurizio. There are a few questions for you in the chat, so maybe during the discussion we can actually answer them.
Entendre, et ça sera, je pense, très intéressant.
So I'm going to speak in French, and it's been extremely interesting to have heard the voice of trade unions and workers. So now we have the representative of employers for Ali. Sometimes it is extremely difficult to find qualified manpower. So what Maurizio has said is extremely interesting. So we have irregular migrants. We have employers who need staff. So as an employer, what is your message in general vis-a-vis this situation? Well, thank you very much, dear Miriam. So so you speak French, you speak Spanish, Italian, etc. I'm absolutely impressed. So anyway, thank you very much for this question. And what Maurizio actually said, it was extremely, extremely interesting. I would like to tell you that in Morocco, the last March, we have signed with the Moroccan patronage. So with the different trade unions, there are 3 very important trade unions in Morocco. We have signed this document. It's like a charter, and so it is extremely detailed as a document. So we have included extremely important issues, but also humane issues, because so we believe that anybody who comes to my country becomes one of us. And also, for example, everybody in the administration sector will tell you, for us, there is no problem. Actually, but when we have a criminal action, so if they commit a crime, so this is something which is inadmissible, which is not acceptable. So once again, we have to come to an agreement to say, okay, we have people who are here. Are we going to send them away, to expel them? So these are drama situation, dramatic, it's families, children, wives. So the reality is completely different. So the private sector doesn't look at things in this way. So the only criterion is competence, nothing but competence, being competent. So thank you very much for having mentioned it, because we have lived this situation. And once again, maybe we can talk about this later on. However, in 2013, we have 60,000 irregular migrants were regularized. So And it's actually 60,000 families because these people married, they have children. So this was a policy that was applied to make all of these people regular people, regular migrants. And then, of course, every single person had to define the reason why they'd come to Morocco, which kind of job, etc., etc. So there was many people, and I think it's Maurizio who mentioned it. So some people come with a tourist visa. It's the same thing for Morocco. They come, they stay a month, like 2 months, and then they stay in Morocco. So, and I would like to mention an example. So we have one of the most important call centers here in Morocco. It's a huge call center. They needed to recruit people who spoke Portuguese. So, so there's people who speak French, there's people who speak English, who speak Spanish, but to find people who speak Portuguese, that either you get them to come from Portugal, and also the minimum salary in Morocco is obviously not the same as in Portugal. So what to do? So they started looking in Morocco. So they started looking for these people, and they found several people who come from Mozambique, from Sao Tome, Principe, from other people, Guinea-Bissau, and they were recruited. So these people, they had all the capacity, all the competence, obviously linguistic. So what did the employers do? They went to the authorities and said, we want to hire these people. And also, they have not committed any crime. They are regular people. They are good people. So once again, to regularize these people, we tried to make things easy for these people. So once again, the most important thing was that they were competent. So they have been regularized, they have their regular permit, and and if you get married to a Moroccan lady, if you're a man, or vice versa, if you're a lady, you can marry a Moroccan man. And then at that point, all the procedure is definitely easier. So once again, the most important thing to do is that you have a labor market that sometimes needs these people. And once again, the problem of Morocco is not the problem of Spain, or not the problem of Italy or France. So when Maurizio tells me about 500,000 irregular people, well, it's not the same kind of situation here in Morocco. However, we must not forget that since 2013, we have this new regime. So we have, so everything has changed in Morocco, especially the foreign people coming from sub-Saharan Africa, and all also from the Middle East. Everything has changed. The impression, the way people are being considered, the way people are being looked at, because if you become part of Morocco, you will become part of the Moroccan economy. So, so we have in 13 different countries, we have free circulation of people. And so you can come to Morocco without any kind of problem. And so how many people live in these 13 countries? More than 440 million. So once again, I think it is important, we must not forget that when we've had the commemoration of the 6th of November, we have this important discourse by the king. And once again, he said, all these people who can come from the 13 countries in the African coast. So we have these agreements with all of these countries and free circulation of people. So things have changed enormously, thanks to all of these new procedures and new laws. And maybe the most important thing is that the vision of Morocco has changed. I know that we still have problems. Nothing is perfect in this world, but we are making huge efforts. And also the vision of Moroccan people had changed enormously vis-a-vis the other person, the foreigner, regardless of where this people comes from. So once again, these want to make the situation easy for these people to get a regular work permit. And so as if these people do not commit any crime, and they can become regular migrants. So I will stop here. Thank you very much, dear Miriam, for having given me the possibility to talk. But once again, we need people in agriculture, in call center, in building. And so these people come, they work, they bring their know-how, and but of course we also have the hyper professionals, but that is not in large numbers, obviously. But I'm talking about these people, and they will bring their know-how, they will bring their ability, and we want them to come to Morocco. And so to be very, very clear, the most important thing, once again, is competence. And these people will be integrated. We're going to do our very best in order to integrate them. And of course, we're going to recruit them. We're going to include them in human resources. And of course, we want these foreigners to come, regardless of the situation, even though it's irregular, we're going to make it regular for them. And of course, even if they don't have documents. And so if we need a specific competence that does not exist in Morocco, we are here to accept them. And my last thing is that the security, if they have not committed any crime, these people will be extremely welcome. I have a second question for you. I know that you are responsible within SGM for the recruitment, for equitable or fair recruitment. So once again, talking about the prevention of irregular migration. So especially when we talk about female migrant workers. So do you have any examples, things about within the Moroccan context? So what have we done within SGM?
Excellent question. You know that there are employers who do not comply with the law. This is what they said. Yes, we know that among our members, there are some who do not comply with the law. But there is a fair recruitment manual of the ILO that says that it is important to sensitize employers, businesses. They have to be sensitized for respect of rights, for fair recruitment. And I would say that most employers comply with these principles. And so what do we have in concrete terms? So we have also protection of migrants. And I also open a bracket for Maurizio. When we talk about partners, words have their importance. We can use these words to be diplomats, but we work in partnership with the trade unions, hand in hand with the social dialogue. But what happened? And there was something positive. I don't know whether Philippe or Jared. No, I think that it was Philippe who said that migrants should be included in trade unions. So we have some trade unions devoted to migrants. So this is done by trade unions. 20 years ago, we talked about trade unions for local labor, but today it's not only local labor. We talk about humans. So we have three main trade unions that are devoted to migrants problems. We signed a chart and we work more. For example, a trade union asks us to integrate a network. So I close this bracket. In terms of our association, we have a chart of diversity. We organized a meeting and we invited all associations for migrant protections, trade unions were invited. We worked, discussed with them, and we presented the fair recruitment manual. We don't say fair anymore because it is obvious. So the labor code of Morocco follows the conventions and recommendations by the ILO and all recommendations of the international migrant associations. So we integrated all these actors. And so this is a fundamental issue. In marketing, we say the enterprise brand. So Morocco is doing the best in order to have the Moroccan brand in order to be recognized and known at international level, in order to have corporate social responsibility, because in order to invest in countries, it is important to look for the corporate social responsibility. This corporate social responsibility label uh, describes enterprises who are comply with the law, and in this way it is possible to gain international markets. But important is to have the maximum number of enterprises to comply with the law. And so we ask normality, because this is normality of a country that complies with the law. So we work hard on this. We do our best in partnership with trade unions. Why in partnership? For migration, we make a lot of things through this partnership. So this is fundamental. If we work hand in hand, we can really do something exceptional. And I stop here. Thank you for your intervention. So we have these possibilities of regularization of irregular migrants. So we needed also to meet Moroccan labor market needs. And so there is this strong collaboration between trade unions and employers in order to better protect Moroccan workers and to include irregular migrants. And there is also this diversity chart launched by the Confederation. And so fair recruitment allows to better protect migrant workers in irregular situations. There are many questions in the chat, but I ask panelists to read the questions in the chat because we don't have a lot of time available. So just to select any questions you would like to answer by the end of the session. You can also answer in writing because there are 37 questions in the chat box.
And now, also moving from, I would say, from Morocco to USA and to Washington. Good morning, because I think for you, Niha, it is clearly morning. Nice to seeing you again virtually. Niha, you have been very much engaged, and I think now, if I might say, we heard a lot from obviously the government, the trade unions, the employers, and with you and with Michelle, we will hear also from the perspective of civil society and how you are both very much engaged into better protections of and protecting migrant workers' rights in an irregular situation. So my first question for you, Niha, is the Solidarity Center is the largest US-based international workers' rights organization. You are even allied with the FLA-CIO, and you assist a lot of men and women workers across the globe with regard to access to decent work, including, obviously, migrant workers in an irregular situation. Can you let us know maybe some of the key actions civil society is taking with regard to protecting the rights of migrant workers who are in an irregular situation? Any specific actions with regard to women migrant workers? Because I know that yourself, you have been very much engaged as well to better protecting women migrant workers. And maybe if you do have some specific case as well in US, as you are presently located in Washington. And I give you the floor, Niha.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you again for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. I know at this point, the interpreters must be exhausted, and I have a tendency to talk a little fast, so I'm going to try to be slow, but Miriam, please give me a hand signal if I start to speed up, because I know it's a very difficult job, so thank you to the interpreters. So as Miriam said, the Solidarity Center is the largest US-based international worker rights organization. We are allied with the AFL-CIO, and the AFL-CIO is the largest trade union federation in the US. And we work on every aspect of worker rights in over 60 countries around the world. And in working with our global partners around the world, including the International Trade Union Confederation, Global Union Federations, thousands of local unions and worker associations and labor support NGOs that are working on worker rights issues. We approach our work through the main perspective that a worker is a worker is a worker, deserving of full labor protections, and in particular, the freedom of association, right to organize, and collectively bargain. I think today in this conversation that we're having on undocumented migrants, three common themes have sort of come out from what I'm hearing other panelists say and from what I want to talk about. The first being is that we have to center migrants, and in this case for me, migrant workers, front and center in this work, and recognize the agency that migrants and migrant workers have themselves to demand their rights. The second is that we need more policy coherence. And I'm going to talk about that, Miriam, in a minute in terms of the work that we do. And then third, we have to ensure access to justice for anyone who works, for all workers in the workplace, or we're going to continue to just to have the policy coherence. We've seen during the global pandemic, even though we knew this before, but now we can't hide from it anymore. We saw during the global pandemic that undocumented workers were essential to our economies. They saved us in so many ways in terms of care work and food services and all of those things. And yet, despite seeing this blatantly during the pandemic, we are not responding in a way that respects the dignity of the work that undocumented migrants have done for us during the pandemic, again, before and after. We are going to see, and I think Michelle talked about this a little bit, as our economies move forward. In the US, for example, we're having major shortages in terms of employment, and undocumented migrants are filling those shortages. And we're seeing an increasing need for workers in the care economy globally. And again, undocumented migrants play a major role in that. And yet, we treat them very differently than we treat other workers. We must recognize the principle of equality of treatment for all workers, regardless of their status. As I said, any migrant, all workers, regardless of their migration status, of whether they're in the formal economy or the formal economy, whether they identify as male or female, whether they're Black or brown, whether they identify as asylum seekers or refugees, climate migrants, economic migrants, or a mix of all the above, must be treated equally under protection of labor laws. And yet, we are anywhere in the world we talk about, including in the United States, we're currently functioning under a broken immigration system that lacks policy coherence. Exploited undocumented migrant workers are often dealt with through ministries of interior, ministries of foreign affairs, and or through immigration law enforcement. They get very little access or protection from ministries of labor and labor law protections. We can't have one set of laws for migrants in domestic work, migrants in agriculture, whether they're documented, undocumented. It has to be the same. We have to have policy coherence. We also need to recognize that undocumented migrants are filling essential services, as I said, and are filling needs for jobs. Employers want workers in these jobs. Our immigration systems and our economic systems have to take that into account. In the United States, the AFL-CIO made a proposal a few years ago to have something called a W visa, where there would be an independent labor commission that would look at what are the real market needs in our economy, and then figure out fair ways to fill those market needs. Regularize the over 11 million undocumented migrants that we have in the United States that are doing this work anyway and are just doing it precariously because our immigration system is broken and the labor market needs does not match the immigration system. We must do more of that. So in the work that Solidarity Center is doing, we call for policy coherence that integrates migration governance into broader economic, social, racial, and gender justice initiatives. The global labor movement has called for a new social contract, and that's an excellent frame for what we're calling for. I'm talking fast, sorry. And so the Solidarity Center is working with migrant worker associations and unions around the world in sectors such as domestic work, where there's large numbers of women, in sectors such as agriculture, again, where there's large numbers of women and undocumented migrants. And we're really centering the idea that I'll leave you with, Miriam, because I know I'm at my 5 minutes, of freedom of association, right to organize, and collectively bargain. If we just focused on that one fundamental ILO right, on the freedom of association, right to organize, and collective bargaining, we would see so many of these problems that we're talking about today for undocumented migrants resolved. When migrants' agency, when workers' agency is put front and center, that solves so many of the issues that we have. And we need to have this policy coherence where I'm talking about. We're moving away from humanitarianism, from asylum, from refugee rights, to a system where we're putting migrants in temporary migration programs that are extremely exploitative. We have to be thinking about policy coherence where we're centering workers' agency front and center, and we're recognizing real labor market needs. Thanks, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Neha, from your intervention. I think here, as well from your intervention, I see how the questions of policy coherence is central. And I think this is very interesting, sorry, because we have seen that from the first intervention coming from Michelle to your intervention now, but it was also clearly present in the intervention from Felipe, Jared, Maurizio, and Ali. And it's quite impressive, again, you know, how we see how policy coherence is at the heart for better protecting migrant workers in an irregular situation. And you highlighted something which has also been mentioned by Felipe in his intervention, the fundamental rights of freedom of association that he rightly also mentioned, and you again put echo and mentioning how this is so important for migrant workers, despite, you know, their statutes, and also for migrant workers in an irregular situation. I will come back to you in a moment, and if you don't mind, we'll ask maybe a question for you, Michelle, because I think for those who so we have the chance here as well, to have with us today Michelle, who is the director of PICAM, the Platform for International Cooperation on Not Undocumented Migrants. If I might say, Michelle, this is literally your daily work, right? Better work, protecting the rights of migrant workers in an irregular situation. We know that the lack of decent working condition is a key concern for undocumented migrants. We know as well that current policy very often denied undocumented migrant access to formal labor market or social assistance. Therefore, most work without official contract in undeclared work jobs, and this is the only option they have to sustain themselves and their family. And obviously, it leads to low or unpaid wages and very insecure and poor working conditions. And most of the time, with no access to social protection. And Maurizio gave the example, of Italy and access to at least minimum cares and emergency care. Can you tell us more about PICAM vision and mission in general, but also how, if you can explain to our audience, what are the PICAM recommendations to improve the labor rights of migrant workers in an irregular situation?
So first of all, thank you very much, Miriam, for the invitation. I'd like to commend the ILO ITC for organizing this. It's amazing to see almost 300 people from so many countries around the world, and the simple questions and the simple things that we're all asking that are the most challenging. I wanted to start by saying that I'm going to intervene on labor, but I actually see that there's a lot of interest also in healthcare. And so it's interesting to see, and this is one of the areas that we also work on within PICAM. But basically getting back to labor, we've existed as PICAM for about 2 decades. And most of what we did in the first decade was to explore what were the key concerns that undocumented workers, mainly in Europe, because our members are mainly based in Europe. We do have some kind of right outside of Europe as well. But basically, what were the concerns of undocumented workers? But most importantly, what was being done about it? What were civil society organizations? What were trade unions doing? Who was researching on it? What were the EU institutions saying on this? So this has been our kind of model of working for the past 2 decades. And I also wanted to start off by saying, when you can say you've been working for 2 decades, you can also look back a little bit. And sadly enough, I would say that one of the things that we see now is still the same as before. The top priority on this continent, and I would also probably say globally, is immigration enforcement. It's not labor rights. It's not victim protection. So how are we doing now in Europe, within this reality? I wanted to highlight 3 kind of areas on how we're looking at labor rights. So the first one is addressing what Jared, what Michelle Layton talked about in her opening as well, what the Special Rapporteur talked about. How is the firewall being implemented? The firewall meaning this protection between immigration enforcement and labor rights or access to services. PICAM did a report in 2020 called A Worker is a Worker. I think within labor rights, we kind of share the same phrases that we think are important, where we looked at complaints mechanisms. So basically, and redress mechanisms that undocumented migrant workers can do in 15 EU member states. This also included the UK when it was a member state, because the research was done in 2019. So what did we find? We found that in 13 out of the 15 that we looked at, civil courts and labor tribunals usually check the identity of someone, but they don't check work permits. And in practice, they don't report undocumented workers for immigration enforcement purposes if the irregular status of the worker is known. So while this might be promising, there's still huge barriers for workers to take complaints, to participate in proceedings and receive due wages and compensation through the courts. This is also true in the criminal justice system, where undocumented victims of crime, including when they're a victim of violence or human trafficking, are often required to leave the country, or they might be deported if they have an interaction with law enforcement. The EU Fundamental Rights Agency did a report in 2021 and found that labor inspectors share undocumented and migrants' personal data with police or with the immigration authorities in 20 of the 25 countries in the EU that are bound by the EU Employer Sanctions Directive. So their research found that there's a lack of safeguards to ensure that the data isn't used for immigration enforcement. PICUM's own work found that there are labor inspectors who report personal information on undocumented workers to immigration authorities, but somehow this actually varies because there's practices which are based on laws, and then there's also some formal cooperation agreements or policies, and then there's common practices. So we actually did find that there are some promising practices of labor inspectors in Europe who do maintain professional confidentiality and don't report. We also looked at health and safety inspectorates, and we found that they're largely independent, although there might be some cases of reporting or joint inspections. So in general, undocumented workers could potentially make a claim for compensation due to occupational illness or injury. However, they still might face a lot of barriers to doing so, and they usually might be excluded from incapacity allowance and health services. So the next 2 points that I wanted to make briefly are, how are we then as PICUM trying to kind of enshrine this firewall principle at the EU level and at the national level? The first one at the EU level, we're trying to make sure that there's the EU policy and interpretation of EU law that's progressive in this area. So for example, the EU has the Employer Sanctions Directive. This is from 2009 and it came into force in 2011. One of the most interesting things from this directive is that EU member states should make sure there's effective complaints mechanisms and procedures by which an undocumented worker could file a complaint against their employer, introduce a claim, and get any judgment for outstanding remuneration. When the European Commission did its follow-up report on the implementation of this directive, so the follow-up report was in September 2021, the Commission recognized that undocumented workers are deterred from filing complaints due to immigration enforcement, and it called on member states to ensure safe reporting. We know that without safe reporting, it incentivizes employers to exploit workers. It provides a cheap, deportable, replaceable workforce. And this ILO has said many times, including by the Committee of Experts. On the EU level, we have the European Labour Authority and we have the Platform on Undeclared Work. These are entities that are coordinated by the European Commission, and these are excellent spaces now for transnational exchange amongst labour authorities, also on this issue. So part of our work as PICUM is to try to contribute to developing EU employment, social, corporate governance, migration laws to ensure safe reporting and decent migration. And the last point that I wanted to mention, how are we then trying to make sure that these effective complaints mechanisms work on a practical level? And this is really through our members who work on the local and the national level. So as some examples, they try to make sure that there's procedural safeguards and mechanisms so that workers can do safe reporting. In Belgium, undocumented workers can file a complaint without risking immigration enforcement, and they would not be detained if they're identified while the inspection is being carried out. We also have good practices in France and in Geneva and Switzerland, some safeguards for labor inspectors. We have other examples of practical barriers that are tried to address. So for example, how do you provide proof that you were working as an undocumented worker? How can you get legal aid? How can you get access to information? That was raised in the webinar. In the Netherlands, there's a presumption of employment if you're undocumented for up to 6 months. So it's presumed you've been working for 6 months. That's a way of showing proof. France, all authorities are obliged to inform about rights and complaints mechanisms. In Austria, the government has specific funding for a center for undocumented workers. We also have examples of residence and work permits that might help workers facilitate a complaint without risking that they could be deported. So Spain, there's a permit which is not dependent on one employer. In Finland, you have a permit to look for work if you would be exploited. Ireland, you could re-enter the labor market if you lost status in the past. So in general, we just see that there's increased cooperation with social partners, lawyers, legal experts, NGOs, workers. All of this helps authorities get evidence. It builds stronger cases, targeting resources and seeing outcomes. We actually have some significant settlements. One worker in Belgium was paid up to 25,000 euros in compensation. So the bottom line, and that's where I would end here, it's basically, it's possible to impose sanctions on employers without punishing workers for exercising their rights. For example, undocumented workers can be paid for the work that they do. Workers and inspectors can maintain independence, and the integrity of labor authorities can be upheld to make immigration policies more fair. But it's a big effort, and it's a collective effort.
Thank you very much, Michelle. You rightly mentioned in your presentation, in your speech, the importance of access to justice and remedies for migrant workers as well in an irregular situation. And I know that PICAM has been very active to that, producing significant application, and you have been very much engaging into that. So coming to the questions with regard to access to justice, and that will be, if you don't mind, maybe the last question for you, Neha, and also for you, maybe Michelle. More in general, from your experience, what can be done to address some of the challenge with regard to the obstacle for migrant workers in irregular situation to first enjoy their rights, but also basically accessing, to their rights through access to justice? Any specific example you wanted to share? So I will maybe give the floor first to Nia, and then finish with you, Michelle. And please, of course, Michelle, tell us more on the guide you published on to undocumented workers' right at work and access to justice. Maybe for you, Neha, first, and then I give you the floor to Michelle.
Thank you, Miriam. And Michelle and I work together a lot, so we can tag team this very well. Just one quick point. I noticed in the Q&A that there was someone made a comment about, in many countries, I keep talking about freedom of association, right to organize, and many other people did too, that this person found in some countries, unions are reluctant to organize migrant workers. And I just need to say something about that, Miriam, because I think it's a fair point. And, we saw that in the United States. We see that in many countries around the world. I will say, though, that doesn't mean my point is wrong. I mean, I think we have to center freedom of association, right to organize and collectively bargain, because that's the only way workers are really, migrant workers and undocumented migrants are really going to have a say in their workplace. And then we work to reform unions so that they're respecting that right. I'll give you an example in Colombia. We work with a union called UNIDAP. It's UNIDAP. I'm sorry, I don't know what the acronym stands for in Spanish. My greatest professional regret is not learning Spanish. But it's a union of Venezuelan migrant workers who work in platform delivery gig work. And they themselves came together and had a grassroots movement to organize and exercise their freedom of association, and then are engaging with unions now. We're seeing time and time again where workers themselves, undocumented migrants who are being exploited, are brave enough to risk deportation for standing up for their freedom of association rights, even when a union is not trying to organize them. They organize themselves. They exercise their own agency to form a union, whether they're allowed to or not under the law, and whether or not they have support from a official union. And I think that we need to just, no matter what, the principle is correct on freedom of association, and we need to exercise that. On access to justice, and then I'll turn it over to Michelle, I will just say this concept of firewalls, and we've talked about this time and time again, every speaker today. When Michelle and I and others, both Michelles on this call and myself and Felipe and others, we're working to advocate to the United Nations on negotiating the Global Compact for Migration, one of the biggest things that unions, workers, civil society, NGOs pushed for was the concept of firewalls. We lost in the Global Compact for Migration, but we know that it's within ILO standards. It's in EU directives, as everyone has talked about. And last year, the Solidarity Center partnered on a study with the Migrant Justice Institute that identified several ways that countries are enabling undocumented workers to enforce their labor rights without exposing themselves to detection by immigration authorities and removal. For example, a number of countries have implemented this firewall concept with varying degrees of separation between immigration authorities and labor authorities and courts to encourage migrant workers to report labor abuses. In the United States, labor law provides that immigration status is irrelevant to wage investigation. And we know that wage theft is the #1 form of coercion used to keep workers in forced labor. The ILO just found this in its global estimate report. And so being able to address wage theft is so crucial. And so in the United States, no immigration status documentation is required on the wage and hour investigation form, which is used to lodge a claim for unpaid wages. And under an MOU, which the unions, the AFL-CIO in the United States supported, with the Department of Labor, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, agreed to refrain from engaging in civil immigration enforcement activities at a work site that is subject to Department of Labor investigation of a labor dispute. And advocates report that the ability to point to a written agreement between the Department of Labor and immigration enforcement has been useful in fighting immigration worksite raids, but they note that the MOU does not give workers assurance that their immigration status will not be revealed or used against them if they file a wage claim in court. Some US states have sought to address this. For example, in Washington state, there's a rule that presumptively excludes evidence of a party's immigration status from all state civil and criminal cases. And more broadly, in many US states, labor departments standardly do not ask for a complainant's immigration status or record immigration status. And if they learn of it, they do not report it to immigration authorities. California state, for example, requires employers to notify employees before and after inspections and audits conducted by immigration officers. And in Australia, the Migrant Justice Institute is leading a coalition proposing a new short-term visa that would enable migrant workers at the end of their stay to remain in the country for a short period to pursue a labor claim. The visa would be available to migrant workers who are assisting government authorities to hold employers to account, as well as migrant workers who pursue a claim against an employer through a union or through courts. And the bona fides of the claim would need to be certified by an expert lawyer within government agency, union, or non-profit sector. The Australian government is considering the proposal in context of reforms it would introduce to address migrant worker exploitation in early 2023. I know, Miriam, I have to end. So just to say the two most important points are firewalls, and then as this Australia proposal notes, giving workers a legal status, a visa to be able to stay, to pursue access to justice remedies.
Thank you so much, Neha. Thank you very much for your intervention. I will give the floor to Michelle, and just reminding you, Michelle, also to slow down for the interpreters, because it's also end of the session, so they also started for them, to be exhaustive. So thank you so much, Neha, for your intervention. And Michelle, before taking some questions from the chat, I won't take all the questions, obviously, that we received so many of them. I identify some of them for our panelists, but Michelle, I will give you the floor with regard to access to justice. I know indeed that you're working very closely with Neha on that. So if you want to add some before we move very quickly to some Q&A before closing the session.
Thank you, Miriam. I'll just say very briefly that within PICUM, about 10 years ago, we started to bring together, we had a big event looking at legal strategies on undocumented migrants' rights. And it was interesting because even before we did that, we had a report that was called 10 Ways to Protect Undocumented Migrant Workers. And in that report, which is almost 15 years ago, we looked at strategies in North America, so as well as in Europe. And we found that in North America, there were quite a few lawyers and civil society activists, basically, who were working on legal strategies on undocumented migrant workers. And we thought this would be interesting to see in Europe. But what we had seen in the past 10 years even is that there might be a lot of networks. There's ones on asylum. There's the Elena network, for example. And there would be lawyers who are specialized on family rights or on detention or deportation cases, but we didn't really find one. We didn't find a lot actually working on undocumented migrant workers' rights. So last year we, after holding this thing 10 years ago, after building up a case law database, after having a specific task force within our membership, we held a legal seminar, and we looked at undocumented migrants workers' rights. And so this is the guide that's been produced actually outlines what all these rights are. We look at two key case law issues for Europe. One is the Toomer case from 2014 from the Court of Justice of the European Union, and the other one is the Choudhury case from the European Court of Human Rights from 2017. In this guide, we also will put the, I think we'll put the chat in the chats, probably the link. We've looked at several EU directives, so labor rights from EU directives that definitely apply because they refer to people or any person employed, or the legal text or the related case law refers to workers or victims with irregular status. And here there's at least 10 EU directives that we found that are applicable to undocumented workers. We also looked at EU directives that refer to workers without a definition or in an employment relationship according to national law. So this guide basically unpacks this as well as the international human rights framework. And I would end, because I know we're tight for time, basically just saying on access to justice, we're looking at it in the labor rights context, but we're also looking at it for people who have experienced crime. So domestic violence, for example. And here we see some developments on the national level. In Spain last year, the Spanish Ministry of Inclusion, Social Security and Migration issued an order to immigration offices to protect women who were experiencing domestic violence when their residence status is dependent on their aggressors. So the order was making sure that they could do that safely, they could report safely. And also on the EU level, the EU is actually looking potentially at revising its Victims of Crime Directive, potentially next year. The strategy that the EU has released on this directive from June 2020 recognized specifically that undocumented migrants are vulnerable to being victims of crime, and that this directive should be implemented in a non-discriminatory way. And there's also a proposal now that the EU has made on gender-based violence. There's a new proposed law around this where it would also implement, if accepted in the negotiations, a firewall principle. So just wanted to mention that, but basically, as Neha said, firewall, 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 keywords, we have to implement them and find creative ways to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you, Neha, for your intervention. And if you see in the chat, in the Q&A, there is a lot of also message from participants thanking all the panelists for their intervention. I will take some of the questions, not all of them, because otherwise we will spend the whole evening together. But let me maybe ask some questions for you, Mr. Gonzalez Felipe, if you don't mind. We have very interesting questions that are coming, that were sent at the beginning of the webinars, more or less, when you took the floor, with regard, to how how can we manage, despite the fact, that there are some, obviously, despite instruments, international conventions, the question with regard of deportation, expulsion made by some governments. Do you know what are some of maybe the actions that you're also taking with your own responsibility as a special rapporteur for maybe the discussion you might have with some government? Is it something that is easily to discuss with government when we talk about deportation of migrant workers in an irregular situation?
Bueno, muchas gracias por la pregunta y otras que se han formulado ahí en el.
Thank you for the question, and thanks for the other questions that people have posted. No doubt, the deportation of migrants in irregular situations is one of the central focus of the rapporteurship in the last few years. Aside from dealing with each subject, gender, migration, right of association, freedom of association, right to migrate, etc., we've addressed all this focused on deportations. With a report made last year from the Human Rights Council on pushbacks, and another one from this year for human rights crossing international borders. One of those involves deportation, or both of those involves deportation. It's a subject that is highly discussed. These two reports have been debated by a larger amount of states that I've had a chance to present within the Council of the General Assembly of the UN as well. There exists a non-resolved tension surrounding this, and it's concerning to see how it's expanded and how it's quote unquote become normalized. The issue regarding pushbacks affecting the non-return principle. In Latin America, or at least Latin America, had subscribed up to last year by a few countries only. And now you see how this practice has become more and more extensive or pervasive. Something that's been practiced for a considerable time in Europe, regretfully, to say the least, has acquired a fakeness, a sort of legitimacy, and it's also being assumed by other states. In that sense, it's indispensable that we continue forward with monitoring the situation in the international borders and emphasizing that pushbacks are contrary to international right, affecting the right to seek asylum, affecting the right to gain access to justice. And if there's violence involved, other human rights can be affected. Thank you very much, Felipe, for your intervention and for your response.
And I also know that I would like very quickly as well to give the floor to my colleague, Miss Catherine Landrit, who is the senior labor migration specialist at the ILO Geneva. So Kat, I don't know if you can put your camera on. Good evening, Kat. So I just want, because I see that we already over past 5 years and 5 p.m. I know that we also need to close as soon as possible. So I will maybe just ask to our panelists, if you see on the chat some pending question to which you think you can provide some contribution. Well, if you can maybe just obviously provided some answer or some of you thought on that. But I wanted, just before we close, to give maybe the floor to our colleague, Kat. And Kat, maybe just before we close, if you can bring back some of the key points, of the webinars and some of the points that clearly are were mentioned by our different panelists. I think it has been a very rich discussion, and I think they are very much thought for thought. And I would like maybe to give you the floor to finalize and to finish this webinar. I would just like, if you don't mind, before giving you the floor, to warmly thanks all different panelists who join us today. Obviously, Mr. Gonzalez, thank you very much for the time you have, and we hope that we see you very soon in an upcoming webinars that we organize within the ITC ILO or through the ILO. This is also a great collaboration between ILO, ITC ILO, and OHCHR. Jared, thank you so much, because you always answer very positively to all our invitations. So this is also very much appreciated. And it's also very interesting, honestly, to hear from Montauban experience. So I wish you to see you very soon as well in one of our webinars. Maurizio, I mean, we are almost neighbors because you are based in Milan. And so I hope to see you very soon as well on our campus. And thank you very much for the great work you are doing. Personally, I know a bit, what Anolf is doing in Milan, and it's quite impressive. And I thank you very much for the effort, because it's 20 years of dedication. So thank you so much for that. Ali, as well, thank you very much for joining us from Morocco. We've been collaborating together since a while, and it's good also to hear from the employers and have a positive talk from the employers on questions with regard to migration and the needs of migrant workers for the labor market. So thank you for that. And Nia and Michelle, I would like also to warmly thank you, Nia, as well. You always answer and present to our request. And in fact, it was during Thanksgiving, and you were watching your message during Thanksgiving. I realized that when I send you one of the last messages. Thank you so much for that, and hope to see you soon, very often in our course. And Michelle as well, the whole PCAM team have always been very much present and always answering yes. And it's great to the work that you're doing, and particularly in Europe for better protecting undocumented migrant workers. So thank you very much for having been with us today and to share some of your experience. Of course, thanks to all the interpreters for the interpretation. It has been very challenging, but you made it. And so thank you very much. And without further ado, Kat, I give you the floor for some of the concluding remarks with regard to this panel of discussion. We have been, and it's quite important to mention, we have been up to 293 participants joining the webinars. It has been recorded, and 900 of you, more than 900 participants registered to it. So potentially we receive as well the link for the recording. This has been recorded in the different languages. So we will share the link with the different participants who registered. Thank you very much. And Kat, I give you the floor for closing this webinar.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you all of you. Thank you, panelists. I mean, this has been a very enriching and exciting discussion, and thanks for all the participants putting the questions in the chat, because I think we thought 2 hours would be too long, but I think we can go on for hours, which means that actually this is a very important topic, a very important issue in irregular labor migration is not going to go away. It is going to stay. And it is very important to find solutions. And as Michelle has rightly put, I mean, migrant workers who are undocumented, who are in irregular situations, they need help. And I think we heard throughout this discussion and in the chat as well, in the Q&A questions, that I mean, there are some solutions that can be proposed. There's many outstanding questions, and I hope we can find a way, Miriam, to reply to some of these or to many of these in a more detailed and elaborated way. But a lot will be also in the compendium that the ILO has produced. Before I go a little bit throughout the speakers, and I try to be as short as possible. But I found a question in the chat, which I think is important to mention in terms of what could be some reasons why there is irregular labor migration, and this is very gender specific. That I mean, the question referred to migration bans, and it is true that some migration law in countries of origin put restrictions on women employment, and which, as from the ILO points of view, is actually also an issue of equality of treatment. So women are also seeking for opportunities abroad, and if there are restrictive bans on their employment, which are often reflecting gender stereotypes in the labor market, whether at national, regional, or international level, then migrant women may actually look into irregular pathways, and even much more less protected, and go to informal networks where abuse can take place. So I think this is a very important point to mention that, and the ILO has also undertaken some research into these bans and looked at it from a point of view of inequality, and that other type of measures need to be sought to address this issue, that protecting women migrants or improving protection for migrant women abroad when they end up in or avoid that they end up in abusive conditions. There are other ways than just restrictive employment policies and preventing them from going to leave. And of course, we have to always look at this when we look at a gender segregated labor market with opportunities at the national level. Often this is also a reflection at the international level. So I think this is something we need to bear in mind. But just very quickly on, I think it is clear from the Q&A questions and from all the speakers that migrant workers, undocumented or not, whether they are in a irregular situation or not, all of them have rights. They have human rights, including labor rights. And this was very clearly put by Michelle Leighton and also by the Special Rapporteur, Mr. Felipe González Morales. So this is something we have to bear in mind, because we continue and at country level, in political discourse, in communities, questions continue to be asked to what extent these migrant workers have rights. So regardless of status, they have rights, they should be respected, and they should have access to justice. So we need to adopt a humane approach, as Michelle Leighton was emphasizing, to ensure social justice and build a more inclusive and diverse society. And when we listen to the Special Rapporteur, Felipe González Morales, I mean, it is clear that there is an international legal framework that protects migrant workers in an irregular situation. These are both the international human rights treaties as well as the international labor standards. So it is also, and this is very important as well in the debate, is to use the correct terminology. I mean, too often still migrants are being called illegal criminals. And we have been emphasizing this, and this has been emphasized at the UN level already quite a while ago, that migrants are not criminals. If they are irregular in an irregular situation, they are not criminals. We have their situation themselves can be irregular, but the migrants themselves should not be criminalized for illegal entry and stay, which leads to xenophobic attitudes, stereotypes, and further discrimination against them. So it is also important to have a comprehensive immigration policy, including also migrant workers in an irregular situation. And the fact that this is possible has been shown to some extent during the COVID pandemic, where some countries have indeed taken measures to include migrant workers or to extend the status of migrant workers to provide them with access to healthcare or further protection. So this is very important to bear in mind. Listening to Jared, I mean, centrality of liability and ensuring the responsibility of all actors involved is important. And he also pointed very rightfully so to the importance of information sharing and very good communication that must exist towards migrant workers themselves. Also, when we are talking about measures to prevent retaliation and the firewalls. Maurizio, thank you so much for pointing us to the role of the trade unions, which is to advocate for change. And this has always been the case, and also for change in the context of the current migration law to help facilitate migrant workers to entry, and because they have to have access to specific sectors. And this has been actually some progress that has been made. So also the way that unions have been advocating for access to healthcare and health services, which is key, of course, for all migrant workers and their family, particularly in the context of crisis situation. Mr. Ali Serrani, en Maroc, voilà, la question principale était les compétences, les qualifications.
The main issue is
des qualifications
and qualifications.
Pour attirer les migrants, et en fait les migrants
in
en
order
situation
to attract
irrégulière
migrants and
dans
irregular
certains contextes ont été
migrants
régularisés
have
pour
been
répondre à
regularized
certains besoins du marché.
in order to meet a certain market
mentionné qu'en
needs. You
2013, en fait, il
mentioned
y avait
that
des
in
milliers de
2013,
travailleurs migrants qui ont été régularisés et que ce
there
changement de
were
politique, le changement de régime a
migrants
eu un
who
impact
were
considérable.
regularized.
Donc, ce qui a aussi changé la vision de Maroc
And
et
so
la
this
situation
changed
et la
the
vision de la communauté
vision
vis-à-vis
of
des
the
migrants.
community.
Vous avez aussi mis l'accent sur
But
l'importance
we
de tous
can't
les
hear quite
employeurs, sur le
well.
corporate social responsibility et bien sûr, dans tout le
Yeah,
contexte et
there is the
l'importance que le
issue
recrutement
of
équitable peut
corporate
avoir
social responsibility.
pour s'assurer qu'il y a des voies de migration régulières
So we
pour
need
éviter
to
qu'il y ait des
have
abus dans les conditions de
migration
travail, des abus dans le
voices
recrutement et
with no
également
abuse.
c'est
And
un moyen important et c'est aussi
this
mentionné
is
dans le compendium
important,
que
and it
le
is
BIT a produit.
mentioned
Donc,
in the
pour
ILO
prévenir des
documents
situations d'irrégularité
in
et
order
d'abus.
to prevent
Niha,
irregular
yes,
and
a
abusive
worker is a
situations.
worker, and including migrant workers in an irregular situation. And you have been mentioning 3 common themes. So migrants are at the front and the center, and they have their own agency, including those in a non-documented situation.
Sorry,
There's
Kat, I
need
will
for
interrupt you 2
policy
seconds.
coherence, and we have to ensure access to justice for all. And this has also been something which came up clearly from the questions in the chat, from the other speakers, and as well from PICIM as well. And it is great to see, and there's actually a lot of hope as well to see that there are so many actions to be taken, and that society and community at different level, as well as governments, they are working to improve the situation. And that there are some good practices, as was mentioned by Michelle from PICOM. Yes, there are some good practices, particularly in Europe. They are, excuse me, this must be better. There are some good practices, particularly in Europe, where countries have tried to establish these firewalls and ensure that migrant workers in an irregular situation can actually have sufficient time to file complaints, to remain in the country when there are cases of abuse. And I think it's important to say that this granting of specific period for migrant workers to claim their rights is really key. And this is also something which is central in ILO standards, particularly those on migrant workers, and also in the UN convention that was mentioned by the special rapporteur. So the concept of firewalls and this making sure that migrant workers are not afraid to talk to labor inspectors and to talk about any existing abuses is of course key. And the other top priority that was also mentioned is the importance of freedom of association for all workers, including for migrant workers in irregular situations. And I would like to repeat what Michelle Layton in the beginning was saying, that yes, we will soon come out with a report that's looking into the obstacles, legal and practical obstacles and barriers to migrant workers to their right to freedom of association and collective bargaining, but also some of the putting some recommendations and looking at strategies to address these. I would invite all of you to look at the compendium. I mean, it is quite comprehensive. It has a lot of examples of particular actions and practices that have been undertaken by governments, by regions, by workers and employers organizations, together or individually at country level. And it's right. It is at least one of the most comprehensive publications that the ILO has now produced on the subject. But in the future, we will try to come up with some specific thematic or regional policy briefs. It's already being integrated in our training in the Labor Migration Academy. We have been taking action, as Michelle was mentioning, on the ground to assist countries to address some of the abuses and to build further capacity. So thank you very much again. we really hope that this discussion today will contribute to building a more inclusive and diverse society, which will include migrant workers who are undocumented or in an irregular situation. So really thank you again and for your patience. It's been a long road and it will be longer in the future. And so action is very important by all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Serrani. Thank you so much.
Bye bye.
Always.
Thank you very much. Bye
Thank
bye.
you, Maurizio.
Everyone.
Bye to all.
Thank
and
you.
Happy
so much.
New Year in advance.
Yes, thank you.